Joining us tonight. Here with USU Extension, we strive to provide research-based programs and resources with the goal of improving both the lives of Utah residents and the ecosystem that supports us. That's why I'm so excited to have Melanie Stock here with us today to chat about composting. Melanie is an assistant professor of urban and small farms, and she's also an extension specialist at Utah State University. Her lab focuses on high-value crops and resource use efficiency to improve the environmental sustainability and economic viability of small farms. She loves teaching community-based education through extension outreach with micro farmers, master gardeners, community gardens, and community members like you. We will take clarifying questions during the talk. So if something comes up and it's relevant to what Melanie is talking about right then, we will interrupt her and answer those questions. If it is more of a general question about composting, then we'll save those and address them at the end. Please enter your questions in the chat, and we will field them to Melanie as we go. And if you have any questions, any questions even about how the chat is working or anything technical, you can also put that in the chat. So thanks, guys.
Compost. So let's go ahead and get started. So I like to be really casual when I talk. If you have any questions, make sure you add them to the chat. I'd hate to move on if something didn't make sense. And I'm really looking forward to having a discussion at the end on your questions and ideas about backyard composting. So I'm our urban and small farm specialist, but I'm also an avid homesteader. And so composting is very near and dear to my heart. So compost is a way to add organic matter to your soil or to your garden. I think a lot of us are familiar with organic matter, but I like to define it as decayed or decaying plant and animal material. So the things lived, they died, and they became organic matter. And so organic matter is what gives soil its dark color. And organic matter is really where plant nutrients are contained. And when we add organic matter to the soil, it really, really helps the soil's health. There's a number of different benefits from adding organic matter to the soil. So anywhere from considering the nutrients that we're adding to the soil, I like to think of this as free nutrients by composting at home. But then it does a whole host of things in terms of improving soil structure. So it makes it easier for water to enter the soil. It makes it easier for the soil to hold water and even easier for it to drain. The list goes on. So our soil really benefits from organic matter. That's really the soul of the soil. I want to put it in perspective for here in Utah. So we'll kind of take a quick trip across the US looking at different soil profiles. And a soil profile is just if we were to dig a pit and take a look at the different layers of the soil, this is what we'd see. So if we start in the Midwest, and notice in all of these profiles, I have a tape measure on the side in feet. So if we start in the Midwest, you can see there's a really deep topsoil layer, maybe almost 3 feet deep, black, rich soil, breadbasket of the world right there. There's about 5% organic matter in that soil. And then as we head west to Utah, you'll notice that the topsoil gets a little bit shallower. It's maybe about 1.5 feet deep in the Utah picture. And it's also a lighter brown color. And that's just because our climate has a lot less precipitation. We don't get a lot of rain in the summer, which means over thousands of years, there were fewer plants that lived and died and became part of the soil. So going into it, when we're thinking about gardening, there's all these recommendations that come from across the United States. One thing is that our soil is really different. And two, we start off with less organic matter. In southern Utah, the average amount is about 0.25%. As we get into the northern Wasatch Front, average soil organic matter content around 2% on average. So if we can add organic matter to the soil, that would really benefit the soil and our plants in turn. So one way to add organic matter to the soil then is by composting. So I want to talk just the generals really quick about composting, some considerations, just the overall process, and then we'll get into the nitty-gritty. So general compost considerations. If we want to think about the overall process, basically we're taking what would otherwise be waste products at home and turning it into this excellent nutrient-rich organic matter for our soil. So when I say waste products, I'll have a whole list of these things, but a couple to kind of think about going forward are, weeds that you're pulling from the garden, fall leaves, food scraps. So when you're preparing food, cut the end off a carrot, you're eating watermelon, there's that big rind. That is all prime material for the compost. So you'd add your material to the compost. You do have to water it and also turn it, and we'll talk more specifics about that coming up. But just by adding material, giving it some water, a couple turns, during that time, bacteria and other organisms are breaking that material down into organic matter. And so that's the process we really want to facilitate. At home, thinking about the benefits, I kind of mentioned this earlier, but just this idea that a waste product that would otherwise go in a landfill is now being upcycled into this really beneficial organic matter that our soil desperately needs. If I like to think of my vegetable garden, I'm very passionate about producing food in my vegetable garden. And when I think about how intense that is, I mean, these little plants that start off at the beginning of the season, and then by the end of the season, they're huge and they're producing all of this food that we're eating. That's really intense on the soil, especially when I think about what is the native vegetation in Utah. So if I even wanted to just maintain the organic matter in my soil and have this intense vegetable garden, I would need to add organic matter because it's going to be broken down in the process. And if I want to increase my organic matter, I need to add even more. And so again, compost is a great way to do that, and it's using things that would otherwise go in the trash. Also thinking about nutrient cycling at home or in your garden. I think starting off, it can seem like, you're buying nutrients, you're planting a plant, you're harvesting from that plant, or maybe it's a flower and you're not, and then it dies and that's kind of it. But really it's a whole cycle. And so we want to complete that cycle. That plant dies, that plant can then become part of the soil and provide nutrients for the next crop. So for example, I've got some trees on our property, and so I like to collect all those leaves, and those get used in my compost and also for mulch on the soil. I like to keep that all kind of cycling as opposed to just giving it away. I also have to stick to a garden budget because I have such a love of gardening. And so this really helps with the garden budget. By composting here in Utah, many people find that they really only need to add nitrogen to their crops, that they can actually get plenty of phosphorus and potassium. So there's three main nutrients that plants need: nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. Generally, you can actually hit your phosphorus and potassium needs entirely with compost. So a lot of good reasons to compost. The first step then would be thinking about where you want to put it. So I have some site considerations. This is my compost. So first would maybe be odor and neighborly concerns. And we'll get into this in a little bit. If you're composting correctly, it really shouldn't stink. But that said, I wouldn't put it right underneath my window or right on the border with my neighbor. There can be times if it's getting too much water in the winter, for example, or you're not putting the right materials and the right amounts in, there is a chance that it could smell. So thinking about that. Generally, the recommendation is partial sun is best. Having a sunnier location makes it easier to continue composting in the wintertime. But if it's in a shaded place, then it's easier to conserve water. It doesn't heat up as much or too much for that matter. I have a good friend who has kind of a similar bin system to me, and he just puts his canoe over it as kind of the roof in the summertime to help block some of that sun, and then in the winter he takes it off so that it actually can get as much sun as possible to keep going. The other things are just making it convenient for you so that you're likely to stick with it. So somewhat close to a water source because it does need to be watered, out of the way. away, and then maybe away from pets and kids. Our dog, since we have rabbits and chickens and we compost that manure, our dog really likes going to the compost and trying to steal a disgusting snack. So wish it was a little bit less available to her. The next thing to think about is the size of the compost. The minimum size is to have one 3 by 3 by 3 foot bin. And the reason for this is because the bacteria are really active in the center. They kind of need this buffer around them. If you think about what the surfaces of compost are like, they're experiencing all kinds of conditions. Intense sun beating down, high temperatures during the day, low temperatures at night. And so right in the middle is this nice little home for bacteria. So you really need that amount of volume to have efficient composting. Then people will decide to have one or more bins. So personally, I have 2 bins. They're actually 4 by 4 by 4. That works well for me. But the idea is that in the first bin, you're adding your fresh material. It hasn't broken down at all. The second bin would have material that you added a while back that you had been turning and that you want to kind of get into the finishing process. And then the final bin, if you were using this typical 3 bin system, would be to have a final cell or a final bin where it's just curing and finishing up and then it's ready for use. So what I like to do is have one bin, since I only have a 2 bin system. I have one bin where we're actively adding in materials, we're turning it, and then after a while, I just want it to finish. So that I stop adding materials to that bin and I begin adding them to the other bin. So there's different ways that you can do it. And speaking of that, you can make this as beautiful or not beautiful as you choose. So here's some examples of designs. The first one here is just hardware cloth that's been zip tied into a ring. I used to run a community garden and we required our gardeners to compost their weeds, and this is what we used. It was an inexpensive way to do it. The key thing is that it's getting aeration. So there's plenty of oxygen getting in, and that's what that screen really allows for. So it can be very simple. It's also very easy to move, you can imagine. It's easy to take it apart and mix it as well. Then here's my bin. This is actually a cover crop growing in front of it. When I moved into the house, it was a blank slate for the yard. The previous owners were not gardeners, we'll say. So I started piling up stuff that I wanted to compost. And then when I had time to build a compost, I did. I'll show plans for that a little bit later on. Let's see, there's other options. We found someone who just made a pile at home. And then let's see if you can see my cursor here. They put a piece of plastic over it to help contain the heat and also contain some of the moisture. That's an option as well. And then there's store-bought and store-inspired ideas. I have not personally used a plastic, one of those tumblers for compost, but I've heard a lot of people who do and really like it. And then on YouTube, there's a number of videos you can check out on making barrels or other containers into a tumbler. So there's just a lot of really neat ideas to do it.
Hey, Melanie.
Yes.
I have a clarifying question.
Right.
What did you say the screening was called that you were using?
So hardware cloth is one option for screen. It's a little bit more robust. Rodents cannot chew through it. It's also more expensive. On my compost, I'm using chicken wire, which is less expensive. It also has a larger cell size, I guess. I forget what that's called. But chicken wire or hardware cloth are both great options to use, depending on what you want to spend.
Okay, awesome. And then the other one was, it looks like they were asking what the big pile next to your compost bin is.
That one in the back?
Yeah.
Yeah, so this house I bought, it's 102 years old, and there was a lot of work to do. So unfortunately, when I moved in, I couldn't immediately begin composting and building the bin. So I just made a pile of debris. That would be weeds, so many weeds. But this is a cover crop I'm growing too, because I also knew I wouldn't have time to plant a garden that year. So yeah.
Thank you. And then just so everyone knows, I will be sending a follow-up email with links to resources and the recording of this video. So if you need to go watch things again, you can totally do that. So if you missed something, don't worry, you'll have lots of chances to check it again.
Thanks for adding that, Hunter. I know I'm talking fast and there's so much information coming your way. So yeah, this is something you can take a look back on if you desire. But I really just wanted to show that there's a lot of diversity in terms of what your compost pile can look like. And actually, this pile back here, this huge pile that I have, that would have been fine, you know, for composting. It's just that it ends up taking up a lot of space when you don't have the walls to kind of keep it up. So there you go. All right, so I wanted to add my bin plan. I'm going to show my Instagram handle at the end here, but I get a lot of questions about what the bin looks like and just the dimensions of it. And so I have this on here for reference if anyone's interested. It is nothing special. I saw a compost bin online that was very expensive, and so I just drew this up based on that to make my own. But again, it's just using 8-foot 2x4s and 4x4s, cut them up, turn them into a bin, but it's nothing special. So, okay. So now there's 3 types of composting technically. There's something called cold composting, which is basically making a pile, letting it sit, not turning it a whole lot. This is mostly what I do actually when I run out of time. I was calling it lazy composting, but it's actually called cold composting. So it's a slower process when you're not actively mixing it frequently. And we'll talk more about that in the next slide. Now, hot composting, you're using the same material. It's just you're turning it a lot more effort, but then it gets done a lot faster. Some people are can be concerned about rodents in the area. If you're hot composting correctly, that really shouldn't happen. But to be extra careful, you could also use trench composting, where you're basically digging a hole, putting in material and burying it. I'm not going to cover trench composting in this talk for the sake of time, but just wanted to point that out. So hot versus cold composting. You're using the same materials. You can have the same kind of bin system. The difference is the man hours spent on it. So for hot composting, you're aerating it or turning it frequently. This is because, like I said, the bacteria are all in the center of that compost. So by mixing it, you're bringing those outside materials in where the bacteria have access to really chew down on them. You're also watering it. So when I say frequently, this is at least once a week. One fellow in Salt Lake, I really liked what he said, that he tries to water it. Every time he needs to water it, he knows he needs to turn it. And so that's about once a week in Utah. But the benefit of hot composting, one, is that it finishes a lot faster in maybe a month, maybe 2 months, depending. But also you can get the temperature of your compost pile really high, and that will effectively kill off weed seeds. And we'll talk about temperature in the next few slides coming up. So those are some benefits from hot composting. It's also easier to keep it going in the winter time. But on the other end, if you just can't get to the pile too often, you still need to water it, add materials, but maybe you're mixing it once a month. That's what I can reasonably do right now, as we do a lot of maintenance on this 102-year-old house. But there is greater weed survival. I was turning my compost in March, I think, and this picture here on the side is what I found. That is all the root of my least favorite weed, field bindweed. So that is a problem associated with cold composting. It also takes longer to finish. But for me, this actually works out really well. I like to spread all of my compost in the beginning of the year, in the spring when I'm preparing the beds, and then I don't like to add compost later on anyway. So if it gets done in a year, that's kind of perfect for me, because I just need it to be ready by spring to be able to spread. So it really depends on you. There's not a right or wrong way to go, just different things to weigh. So we've talked about overall thinking about composting, where to put it, how much effort you want to put into it. So now let's talk specifics. Okay. So here's a diagram of the process. I've got this compost pile here in the center, very fancy diagram to represent it. And now we need to think about adding food for organisms. And this means adding food for the bacteria who are going to chomp down on it and turn it into organic matter. So there's really 2 types of ingredients that we're adding to the compost, and they're known generally as green material and brown material. So green material has a lot of nitrogen in it, and it usually has a green color. For example, freshly picked weeds are a green material. They've got a lot of nitrogen in them. Excuse me, a brown material is something, they're usually brown. So fall leaves, for example, or dead grass, and sawdust and so forth. I'll have a list, I think, in the next slide here. So it's this idea where you're adding these two types of materials together. Bacteria need both. It's like this peanut butter and jelly sandwich. They've got to have both ingredients to make this work. If you're only using green materials that are high in nitrogen, it can start to smell. If you're only using brown materials, so really high in carbon, woody material, it's going to take longer to break down. So getting this right ratio is kind of key. And we'll talk about that too coming up. The next thing is, yeah.
Sorry, I have one more clarifying question. We're getting lots of questions about weeds in your compost and if you can spread the weeds by having them in your compost. So
totally can. Yes, I've got a slide on what temperature you need to get your compost up to effectively kill weed seeds. And so for me, like when I pull dandelions, they're easy enough to just compost, but something like bindweed that is so persistent, that just goes to the chickens. I don't anymore. I don't want to mess with it in the compost. So yeah, that's absolutely an issue. And adding fall leaves to your compost can actually introduce weed seeds too. And so that's just something to weigh if you want to go the hot composting mode to really try to break that down as much as possible, or if you don't mind weeding as much, just different things to think about. I don't really think my compost introduces that many weeds though. I also do a lot of mulching in my garden, which is another story, and that suppresses weeds too. But so here we're doing this balance of green and brown materials, and I will identify those in the next slide. We're adding water to the compost, and in turn that compost it's living, it's teeming with bacteria. There's going to be water that evaporates. It's going to produce heat that gets released from the compost pile. I can't tell you what a prideful feeling it is when you're turning your compost in the winter and you see the steam roll off. Oh, it's such a good feeling. And then you know it's working. It also releases carbon dioxide. It can release other things too, but that's the general process. And then what you get from that is the finished product, the organic matter, and that is what's food for the garden. So you start with food for the organisms in the compost, and you end up with food for your garden. So let's define the brown and green materials. There we are. So I'm going to talk about what these numbers mean in a sec, but let's just kind of list these out. So any kind of mature or dry grass is considered brown. If you mow the lawn and you have these nice green grass clippings, they're considered, while they're green, they're considered a green material. But as they turn brown, they're then a brown material. You lose that nitrogen in the drying out process. Woody materials are a brown material. So this can be anything from sticks, wood chips, wood shavings, wood pellets, things of that nature, all woody materials. It has a lot of carbon in it. I don't think anything else tops it in terms of carbon as a woody material. So you can just picture how hard that would be for bacteria to break down as opposed to grass clippings or fall leaves. So for woody material, it's a good idea to try to get it as small as possible. So not just throwing branches in the compost, that's going to take a long time to break down. Let's see here. Untreated paper products are also a great brown material that you can add. You want to stay away from those really shiny ads that you get in the mail, but otherwise untreated paper breaks down fantastic. I met this one master gardener who just topped it all in terms of composting because she could actually compost cotton t-shirts by shredding them up small enough and having the right amount of brown material and green material in her compost. Here in the middle, this is a picture of our Christmas tree. We always get a live tree and it always becomes part of the garden at the end of the year, so that's fun. It definitely counts as a brown material though, because it's very woody. So we have to cut that up smaller. Green material on the other hand has a lot of nitrogen. So this is our grass clippings, this is our weeds, kitchen residuals. So when you're cooking, when you're preparing raw vegetables and fruits, any extras from that can go in the compost. But what kitchen residuals does not mean is if you have been cooking, you don't want to add your cooked food into the compost. And the reason for that is because we usually use salt when we cook. Salt is very bad for the soil, especially here in Utah. Coffee grounds are also considered a green material. I think they have about 2% nitrogen, so very rich nitrogen source. A number of people I know have deals with coffee shops where they leave 5-gallon buckets. Those get filled with coffee grounds and then they pick them up frequently and return a clean bucket to the coffee shop. And then manures, and I've got a slide dedicated to manure to talk a little bit about that. I should say that I'm really passionate about manure, so of course there's an extra slide on that alone. I mentioned I have rabbits and chickens. Actually, the reason I got a rabbit in the first place was when I was living in an apartment. It's an apartment-friendly manure source. That's just great for composting and gardening. Here's some rabbit manure. Eggshells, I want to mention because they're not really a brown or a green material. They are calcium carbonate or lime. Our soils have excessive amounts of lime in them already. So I don't know if you remember the picture of the soil profile of Utah, where it had the lighter colored topsoil, but then the soil was almost a whitish color below. That's because of all the lime we have in the soil that's naturally there. So eggshells, they're not going to really hurt, but the garden doesn't need them. Personally, since we have chickens, I just give them back to the chickens. They can use the calcium more than the soil can. So speaking of manure, it depends on what the animal is and how much bedding is included with that manure, because wood shavings are going to be a brown material. But before I show that slide, I want to talk about the numbers here. So the numbers are getting at the carbon to nitrogen ratio. So what that says is that any material that has more than 35 carbons for every 1 nitrogen is brown. So here, dry grass has 70 carbons to 1 nitrogen. So that's a lot of carbon to nitrogen, making it a brown material. Woody material, like I mentioned, it's very hard to break down. It's just packed with carbon, more than 200 carbons for 1 single nitrogen. On the other end of this is the green material. So anything that has less or fewer than 35 carbons to 1 nitrogen is considered green. That just means there's a lot more nitrogen in it. So for example, there's 20 carbons for every 1 nitrogen in grass clippings. And so this is a way you can kind of keep track of what you're adding to your compost. And I'll give the ratio, the recipe coming up here, but I just wanted to start familiarizing you with those numbers and thinking about it. But if you're not a numbers person, that's fine too. Just kind of think brown materials, lots of carbon, need to balance that out with nitrogen. So I promised more on manure, and here we are. The USU Soil Test Lab tests a lot of manure, and they gave me access to all of their data. And so I went through it just to find the average nutrient amounts, pH, salinity, C to N ratios, etc. And so I found the averages for these different animals, and I just wanted to post it to show here. So how much NP and K, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, those are the 3 primary macronutrients that plants need. pH, salinity. So our goal is to have a pH around 7, that's neutral. So just know that when you're adding, if you add manure to the compost, manure has generally an alkaline pH. So it has a higher pH. It's above 7. So that's going to bring the pH of your end product up, just to be aware. But the biggest thing I want to point out is salinity. Okay, so there's a lot of things that can count as salt in the soil. And when we're growing horticultural crops like fruits, vegetables, nuts, flowers, they are very sensitive to soil salinity. And our soil salinity here in Utah trends on the high side. On average, our soil salinity across the state is anywhere from 1.5 to 2. And 2 is kind of the magic number that plants, especially these fruits, vegetables, flowers, start to not perform as well. We start to see decreases in yield and growth. So magic number being 2, manure can be a way to introduce salt into your garden through compost. And I spend some time on this because in the spring, the most common question I get is something's wrong with my plants. What is it? They'll send me a picture I'll see some salinity damage or some salt damage on the crop, and my first question is, have you added compost or manure to your garden? And the answer 9 times out of 10 is yes. And so we end up tracing it back to the compost that it's got this high salinity to it. So just be aware, particularly chickens have a high salinity. So if you're adding that to your compost, which I add it to my compost, but it just means that I'm going to spread that compost a little more thinly on the soil to be careful of the salinity. So anyway, but here are the C to N ratios here on the end of the table to kind of fill in from the last slide. Things not to add. Wood, you could add it if you shredded it. Otherwise, it's just too big. It's going to slow down the process. Meat actually is a green material, but so it does compost quite well actually, but it can smell in the process and attract undesirable animals. So that for that reason we say don't add it. Cooked or salted food, again, salt, that's going to add to your salinity. Table salt is not a plant nutrient. You just don't want it at all in the compost, especially here in Utah where we don't get the rain to just wash it away. You don't want to add any dog or cat poop. If you have diseased plants, even if you're getting your compost hot, you don't want to add them to the compost. Here's a picture of bindweed, is one to think twice about because it's so persistent. Here's a table that's kind of interesting, and it's got a few common weeds and thinking about their seeds and how hot the compost has to get to kill them. So in this table, there's 140 degrees, and then it goes down from there, and how long you'd need to keep the compost at that temperature in order to kill those weed seeds. So if you got your compost up to 140 degrees, it would only need to stay up at that temperature for about an hour to kill annual south thistle or barnyard grass. Bindweed, not dead. That's not going to do it. And then if you have a lower compost temperature, you can see that it just takes more time to kill those seeds. You have to keep it up at that temperature for a longer amount of time. I know this is a busy slide, and maybe it's just me being nerdy, but I just thought this abstract was really funny because they were talking about the temperatures to kill the different weeds in their tests, and it said seeds of all species except field bindweed were killed. And that's what everything I have here is highlighted. So all these other ones are easier to take care of. It's the field bindweed that's just a killer. So you'd actually have to keep it up at 180 degrees for 7 days to kill it. So that's one weed I recommend not adding. I'm running late on time, so I'm going to go a little faster. This is less technical stuff now. Generally speaking, think about adding 2 parts of brown material for every 1 part green. There's an excellent link I'm going to show in a few slides here from Wasatch Community Gardens. James from the Green Team Farm does an awesome video on composting, and he talks about how you can measure this. So he has a 5-gallon bucket system that he fills out. You could use yogurt containers if you wanted to measure, but also you can just layer these on top of one another. And if the compost isn't breaking down quickly enough, you know your ratio's off a little bit. But the idea is to layer them. So we collect our food waste in yogurt containers. And when I'm going to take it out to dump on the compost, I weed right beforehand, and I put the weeds over that, or I clean the coop out before that. And so it's just a nice way to kind of protect stuff that potentially could smell. Make sure that you're adding water. You want it to be about the moisture of a wrung out sponge. And then the key is just to turn it. The more often you turn it, the faster it'll break down. So once a week is a great goal. Some people do it more than that. Okay, when is it done? When we go through the process. So continue to add material to the compost. If you're going to do hot composting and you want to kill the weed seeds and be really sure of that, know that every time you add new material, that clock resets, right? So how many days or how many hours you want to keep it at a certain temperature. Again, mixing is important because it brings the raw material into the center of the bin. You can watch it heat up. There's compost thermometers that you can buy at your local nursery. You can feel it with your hands. You can see the steam. But then ultimately, so you'll be turning it and turning it and turning it. And one day it's just not going to heat up anymore. And that means that that compost has finished and it's just time to let it cure. So when is it done? It shouldn't smell. It should smell earthy. I guess it shouldn't, if you can identify it, it's not done. So it shouldn't resemble the initial materials. But ultimately, it's done when you're ready to use it. And so here's a link to that video from Wasatch Community Gardens that I think it's great that James put together on how to compost. So finished products. Here's the ideal compost. So this is part of that study I did where I went through all the soil test results. Our lab also tests compost. So I broke this up into different types of compost that included manure by animal type. And then there's other types of compost. So down here on the bottom, for example, is plant-based. So there was no manure added. And so these are the things that you want to look for in compost, that you want to strive for in making your own, or if you're buying it, you can request their analysis. And so this is what you'd want to know if it's a good compost or not. You want a pH near 7 if possible. It's probably going to be a little bit above 7, especially if you're adding manure. But that's the ideal pH for plants. You want low salt. So remember, 2 is our magic number for plants. So the lower the salt content in compost, the better. You can see that the composted chicken manure has got a higher salinity. And that, by the way, here's a picture of some chicken poop. That is because of the urine. So this white stuff on the chicken manure, that's actually their urine, and that's what's containing all the salt. That's why that's so hard to get lower. So lower salinity, pH near neutral, ideally. And if there's more nitrogen in it than phosphorus and potassium, that's great. Our soils tend to excessively accumulate phosphorus and potassium. And so you can easily get to excessive levels if you're adding too much compost to your soil. So there's a lot of different ways to add organic matter to your soil. Compost is just one way to do it. It's a great way to do it. You just don't want to overdo it. So how much should I add to the garden? These are some, or to the lawn, these are some rules of thumb. We usually say about 1 inch per year to annual gardens. So thinking about annual vegetables or flowers, that's generally a safe amount to add. Since I am composting with my chicken manure, I am closer to about 1/4 or 1/2 inch because I want to be really careful about the salt content. If you really want to increase your organic matter fast, there's other things to do like adding mulch and cover crops. I wouldn't only rely on compost, but if you're absolutely sure it's low in salt, it's just a plant-based compost, you could add more of that. But oftentimes it's kind of logistics that get in the way more than anything, because even just adding 1 inch of compost over 1,000 square feet, that's a heck of a lot of wheelbarrows anyway. So with that, I just have a summary of what I've talked about tonight. Compost is a great way to create organic matter for your soil. Our soil is absolutely hungry for it. Remember, our native soils naturally have less organic matter to start with. And then when we start intensively gardening, and gardening is intense on the soil, we need to add organic matter. I like composting a lot at home because it's free to do after building the initial bin. And it's a great way to upcycle home waste and just reduce what's leaving the property as a waste product. But do make sure to keep an eye on green and brown sources. Make sure you're watering the pile. I'd say that's the #1 reason that the compost will stop working, is that it's not being watered enough. Make sure it's turned as frequently as you can. If you can't do it very often, it still will work. It just is going to take longer, and then let it cure, but be careful of salt. And with that, I am ready for questions. 10 minutes for a discussion, so that's great.
Awesome. We have lots of questions.
Whoa, sweet.
Okay. So let's get to some of the ones that people were asking. All right. So we have Debbie Seaver asks that she says she was told to leave her mallow in the ground, but cut off the tops and throw them into compost because they are nitrogen fixers. Does that sound correct to you?
I don't think mallow is a nitrogen fixer. It does have a nice taproot, so one could argue that it helps compacted soil by creating some pore space with that root, but I'd say probably just pull up the whole plant and compost it. I don't think there's really a benefit for leaving it in the soil.
Okay, awesome. And then let's see. Are there any leaves that are bad for compost? Her neighbor has a walnut tree and said that the leaves were bad for gardens.
Yeah, we generally say to stay away from black walnut in particular. Yeah, don't do that. Otherwise, you're good. Pine needles are fine. We get questions about that. They're acidic, but honestly, our soils are quite alkaline and very, very buffered. So even if you add some pine needles, it's not going to change the pH. But yeah, the biggest concern with leaves is just that it can introduce weed seeds. And also, if you can, mow over them first, just to break them into smaller pieces. Boy, they'll compost so quickly. And then they won't get matted up either. So
That's awesome.
Blackwell.
There was a question about your Christmas tree in particular. They were wondering if you like chop it up before you put it in the compost and how to.
Okay, so there's actually more to this story than I let on. So the purpose of the Christmas tree, there's a few things. So the actual, I'm getting on a tangent here, rope it in. I actually like to use it as a mulch to start off in the garden. So the biggest challenge I have at home is my brown material, because I want to use it as a mulch on the garden, but I also need it for the compost. And so the main thing that we do with the Christmas tree is actually cut off the boughs first and use it as a mulch on the garden so I like to plant kale and collards early, so usually around March. And so it's just a really great ground cover to use. And then the pine needles will oftentimes just come off the branches and become part of the soil that way. But yeah, for anything like gets added to the compost, we have to cut it up really small. So this year we're considering buying a shredder. We'll see. But yeah, anything with woody trunk or branches, it's got to be cut up small. Otherwise it'll take a long time.
Awesome. I had a question from Natalie about, this was going back to the beginning with the stages of the compost. If you have a pile that is stage 2, but you only have a single bin or double bin, can you mix materials that are in different stages, or is it better to keep them separate?
You absolutely can mix. And when I was gardening at my community garden before moving here, I only had a single bin for many years. The only thing to keep in mind is that every time you add material, you're resetting the clock. So if you wanted to get your compost to a certain high temperature to kill things off, you're resetting that when you add new material. So what you could do, I'm trying to think of how you would do that with one bin, especially if you wanted it to turn over quickly. I guess when you got it, you had enough there that you wanted just to finish, maybe you could just move the bin or shovel it out and have it in a pile so that you could be continually adding new stuff. Or if you don't care about temperature, you could just keep adding the ingredients in and then use it when you're ready, and it might not be fully done. The bad thing about that is you just would never want it to heat up after you add it to your soil, because that could burn your crops. So a couple ways to go about it.
Awesome. Let's see. Natalie also asked, do kitchen residuals, aka fruits, veggies, eggshells, need to be organic?
No.
Awesome.
That's important to you.
Okay. Okay, so Doug has a very odd question, but he says, I heard that urine, especially male urine, is nicely acidic. So instead of watering my compost, sometimes I tend to just pee in it. Is that like crazy?
Okay, what was so urine, you heard urine was acidic, so you tend to add urine to it. It's not crazy. Urine is a great nitrogen source. So you're helping, I guess it's a green material, if we want to look at it that way. The thing I don't know is for human urine, what its salinity is. So you're adding nitrogen. Presumably you're getting that compost hot enough to kill off any pathogens, although urine is supposed to be sterile when it's coming out. But anyway, yeah, no, you're adding nitrogen, but I would just have an eye on what the salt is like of the end product. So not crazy at all. There was actually an experiment at my old community garden with hay bale gardening, and urine was involved. So I've heard this a lot.
That's awesome. There are a couple of questions about can you turn your compost too often?
That's a great question. You know what? I don't know the answer to that. If you were turning it every day, would that give them enough time to work, and would that actually slow the process down? You've stumped me. I don't know. I'm going to have to look that up.
I'm keeping track of all the questions, so we can, if you find an answer later, we can send it out in the follow-up email.
Yeah, I just wonder maybe if that's like your form of exercise too. I mean, it can be pretty intense turning the compost. maybe there's other benefits of it too that to weigh in, like it's a great workout that you just want to have, but I wonder at what point is the effort worth it? I've heard of people doing it every 3 days, but I don't know about more than that.
Awesome. I had one that was, is there something wrong with your compost when you can hear it gurgling? They say, really? And it apparently glows, phosphorizes in the dark, is what they said. I know it, that means high humic acid. Is that a fail?
I don't know. No, I don't think. I mean, I guess I need more information. So this gurgling sound, is that when water is added? Are there any secret ingredients in this compost? I just need more information on what's happening there. I've not heard of that happening.
Okay,
Animal in it?
if you want to comment with that, you can do it and I'll send it to Melanie. Awesome. So one other question was, what about adding commercial fertilizers to stimulate the composting process?
Great question. So it depends on so part of it is a value call. I know some people are against it because they really want it to be all about natural things, and that's one opinion. But certainly adding a commercial fertilizer could help. I would not add more phosphorus and potassium because usually the finished product from compost is equal parts NPK. It's usually around 1% nitrogen, 1% phosphorus, 1% potassium anyway, and it'd be great to have a little bit higher nitrogen amount. And when we're thinking about the process and bacteria breaking down and needing carbon and needing nitrogen, it could make sense to add nitrogen to your compost, especially if you feel like you're heavy on the carbon. That's actually been happening. It happened in the winter because of cleaning the chicken coop so often. There was so much wood shavings, they're bedding. And so I actually could use more nitrogen in the compost. So there's a lot of nitrogen only fertilizers that you could add. A nitrogen only fertilizer, if you take a look at a fertilizer, it has 3 numbers on the bag. Those numbers represent the percentage of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in that order. So you want a big first number and 0 or a very small number for the second 2. So for example, feather meal is an organic nitrogen only fertilizer. It's 1300. That would make sense to add. Or a conventional fertilizer, urea, is 4600. Those are all nitrogen only that you could absolutely add to speed up the process if you think you're heavy on carbon.
Awesome. Okay, so it's 7:28, so maybe we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. So one from Debbie is, if my soil is basically clay and becomes solid without turning, is compost the best route to make it more healthy?
Yes, absolutely. You want to be careful it's not a high salt compost, but yes, compost helps sandy soils and it helps clay soils so much more than anything else. So for the clay, that can help break it up. It really improves drainage. It really makes the soil have better pore space. So if we can picture the soil to be like a sponge with all the little holes in it or all the little pores, and when we add organic matter to clay, it helps add more pore space, which helps with the water drainage. So yeah, that's the #1 way to improve a clay soil, is adding compost, low salt compost, or excuse me, I should say organic matter in general. So adding mulches, growing cover crops, those are also great ways to amend a clay.
Okay, awesome. And then one more. So Emily says that in her garden boxes, she has always filled them up with compost from the landfill. Is this a problem? The main thing is that my plants get huge but don't produce tons of fruit. And she said she's maybe worried that she's added too much compost. Sorry, let me see.
Not knowing really anything about your garden and having no business making this description, but for the sake of time, like me. So here on my table, I've got municipal. This is representing our general landfill compost, but they vary a lot. So keeping that in mind, they have a high salinity, but you could be adding too much. We don't recommend having a raised bed or a garden that's pure compost. And so that could absolutely be a problem.
Awesome.
Not a problem, but I would just hold off on it. I do want to mention that, so phosphorus and potassium here are on the list. Potassium actually counts as a salt to the soil. So you want to have enough potassium for the plant because it's top 3 nutrient, But you don't want to have more than that, or it's just contributing to the salt in the soil. Phosphorus is an environmental contaminant. This is what makes Utah Lake green, the algal blooms. And so if we're thinking about sustainability and soil health, these things accumulate in our soil a lot. And so when we're adding a lot of compost, that's what we see start to get to excessively high levels. So it's not great for the environment, and it's not great for the soil too. So if I had a raised bed that was pure compost, I would back off from that for a while. Wouldn't add more compost.
Awesome. I'm going to ask you one more question before we go. Rachel is wondering if you can use pressure treated wood to build your compost container.
That's a great question. I did not. I did stain it though. I had leftover from the fence, from staining the fence. A couple of things on treated wood. So you would never want to use railroad ties or creosote treated wood. That's not safe. Also, treated wood from, gosh, I'm trying to remember what year it was that it got banned, if it was 04 or 2008. But the CCA treated wood, copper chromated arsenate, that's actually banned by the EPA. You can no longer buy it in stores, but you could potentially get it if you were getting wood from someone else. You don't want to have CCA treated wood because of the arsenic. That's a heavy metal, and there is concern about that getting into plants and then being taken up, and also just handling it yourself. And if you're cutting it, things like that. There's treated wood now it's a copper treatment that's supposed to be healthy. Don't know if that would change. And same with the stain too. It's more in the processing of it, of applying it yourself and making sure you're wearing a mask and things like that. But otherwise it's supposed to be safe, but yeah, judgment call. You could just use untreated wood or unstained wood and then just plan to rebuild every so often. That's also a reason why I use mostly chicken wire. One was for the aeration, but also just to have less contact with wood too. If you think about it, it gets pretty diluted out too if there were to be found later on. I mean, right now it's EPA, it's okay, but if something came up later, I could think about it that it's really not touching much of the wood. And then in turn, I'm only adding a very small amount of compost to my garden anyway. And then on top of that, it's very hard for a lot of these elements, I guess, to get into the plant in the first place. Root vegetables are ones to be concerned about, and things like lettuce. But in terms of tomatoes and where we're eating the fruit, it's quite a pathway to get into there. But that's another story for another time. So
great. Well, thank you so much, Melanie. I'm sorry we didn't get to everyone's questions, but I have copied them all down, so we have them, and we'll try to answer whatever we can for you guys. So I'll keep track of those. Thank you everyone for joining us. Look for an email from me by the end of the day tomorrow. It takes a little while for the recording to go into my inbox and for me to be able to see it. But once I have that, I'll send a follow-up email. I'll include all of the links from Melanie's slides in that follow-up email, and I'll also provide any other resources that we have for you and a link to the survey. So please let us know how we did afterwards. I apologize for the issues in the beginning, but thank you for joining us, everyone. Thank you so much, Melanie. We super appreciate it. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
I just wanted to say thank you, and also I put the Qualtrics survey in the chat again, and I had a trouble with spacing, so I entered it twice. So it's a direct link. So if you just want to click it now and fill it out, that would be great. In Extension, they look very heavily on surveys to tell us how well our programs are doing, and it helps us plan better programs for you. So we would really, really appreciate it if you filled it out.
yes, please do. Thank you so much for filling that out. USU needs to keep tabs on me, so I really appreciate your feedback on those. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great night.
Thanks.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.